Chapter 1. In the Shadow of War. It was the winter of 1945. Europe, nearing the end of World War II, had been reduced to rubble. People were hungry, homeless, and hopeless. Thousands of refugees struggling to survive amid the bombed-out cities were waiting for the war to end. Among these refugees was young Rachel, just 9 years old. She had lost her family during the war. She remembered the last moment she saw her parents. As their town was bombed, her father had tightly held her hand, and they were running toward a shelter with her mother. But a blast had changed everything. When Rachel opened her eyes, she was alone. She wandered the streets for days, hungry and frightened, before seeking refuge in a refugee camp. The people there were just as lost as she was. Hunger, disease, and hopelessness surrounded every corner of the camp. At night, Rachel would look at the stars, trying to hear her mother's warm voice. But all she could hear was the wind howling. Rachel remembered the stories her mother used to tell her. Every night, her mother spoke of God's mercy, goodness, and hope. But now, everything had changed. Chapter 2. The moment she lost her faith. One day, food was being distributed at the camp. While Rachel waited in line, she saw an elderly woman collapse from hunger in front of her. No one even attempted to help the woman. Everyone was so weak and hopeless that they were focused only on their own survival. Rachel sat on the ground, unable to hold back her tears. She had always believed in God, but now everything seemed meaningless. If God really existed, why was so much suffering taking place? Why weren't her parents there with her? Why was she so alone? That night she looked up at the sky and whispered, "God, if you really exist, why are you not here?" But there was no answer from God. Chapter 3. The Old Man and the Apple. The next day, while Rachel sat quietly in a corner of the camp, an old man approached her. He had long white hair and tired yet kind eyes. He looked at Rachel and pulled a small red apple from his pocket. "This is for you," said the old man. Rachel looked at him in surprise. There had been no proper food in the camp for days. Why was the old man giving her this precious apple? Rachel furrowed her brows. God's love? At that moment, anger surged within her. She squeezed the apple tightly in her small hands and spoke with a frustrated voice. "If God's love exists, why is there so much suffering? Why did I lose my family? Why are people starving to death?" The old man sighed and gently shook his head. Then he began to speak. Chapter 4. God's Silent Answer. A long time ago, in a distant country, there was a man, he said. This man endured the greatest pain in the world. He lost his family and everything he had. For days, he went hungry, crying out to God in his loneliness. But he received no answer. Eventually, he gave up. "God doesn't exist," he said to himself. "If he did, he wouldn't leave me like this." Rachel looked into the old man's eyes. His story seemed very familiar. But then, the man continued, one day when he was exhausted from hunger, a stranger gave him a piece of bread. He took the bread, ate it, and in that moment he realized God may not answer from the heavens, but perhaps he reaches out to us through small things. Rachel looked at her hands. She was tightly holding the small red apple. Her eyes filled with tears. Chapter 5. Finding Hope. Again. That day Rachel ate the apple. But that apple was more than just a fruit. It was what brought her hope back. Days passed and the war came to an end. Rachel was adopted by a group that cared for orphans, and she began a new life. As she grew older, she never forgot her days in the camp. Years later, while walking in the market, Rachel saw a poor child searching for food. The small child in old clothes was rummaging through trash. Rachel took an apple from her bag and handed it to the child. When the child took the apple, their eyes filled with tears. Rachel remembered the old man and that day. She understood now. A small act of kindness could change a life. Time passed, and Rachel grew up to start a charity organization. She now provided food and shelter to thousands of orphans. Whenever she shared her story, she always carried an apple in her pocket, because she knew how that small act of kindness had changed her life. And every time she gave an apple, she remembered the old man's words. Sometimes an apple is a reminder of God's love. Chapter 6. A New Beginning. As time passed, Rachel became accustomed to her new life. The pains from the camp, the deep scars in her eyes slowly faded. But one thing never changed. That red apple. Rachel always carried an apple in her pocket. That apple reminded her of hope, God's love, and the power of kindness. The hardships she had faced only made her a stronger person each day. One morning, Rachel decided to leave the camp and settle in a town. She was no longer alone. A group of orphans had embraced her as their own mother. Every day, Rachel fed them and shared with them the love and goodness of God. Even in the toughest moments, Rachel was always a light of hope. One day, the mayor of the town visited her. "Rachel, you're accomplishing such a great thing," the mayor said, "but we need more stories like yours here. Everyone should hear about what you've been through and your success." Rachel nodded and thanked the mayor, but deep down, she still felt something was missing. No matter how much help she gave, she wanted to change the life of every child and every orphan. In that moment, she made a decision. She had to establish a charity organization. Rachel thought that it would not only be a way to help others, but also a way to heal herself. Chapter 7. A New Heart and the Charity Organization. Rachel named the charity she was going to establish Light of Kindness. At first, it seemed like madness in the eyes of the people in the town. But over time, Rachel's determination and perseverance began to inspire everyone around her. The organization didn't just provide food and shelter. It also offered support to children dealing with the psychological trauma brought on by the war. Every child had a dream, and Rachel guided them toward making those dreams come true. One morning, while Rachel was working in her office, the door knocked. A child entered, wearing old clothes. His face was dirty and tired, but his eyes were filled with hope. His name was Maxim. She welcomed him inside and immediately gave him a sandwich and hot tea. The boy thanked her gratefully. "Can I stay for a while?" Maxim asked. Rachel smiled. This was something she always wanted to remind others. Helping someone, touching their life, giving them a sense of security could change a life. Maxim, like Rachel, had felt lost and alone. But here, at Light of Kindness, he found a family. From that day on, Maxim spent every day with Rachel. They cooked together, read books, and Rachel spoke to him about God's love and how to stand tall, despite life's challenges. One day, Maxim said to her with courage, "Rachel, when I'm with you, I find the things I thought I had lost. You're like that apple. You're always a light of hope." With tears in her eyes, Rachel hugged Maxim. In that moment, she realized, just as the old man had said, an apple could remind you of God's love. But sometimes, touching a person's life was one of the most precious gifts. Maxim's life had been changed by Rachel's kindness, and this change spread throughout the entire town. Chapter 8. One More Day, One More Child. Years passed and Light of Kindness grew. Many children grew up in the safe haven that Rachel had created. Each one had a different story, but they all carried the same hope. Rachel had earned the most valuable reward of her life. Instead of losing her childhood and enduring pain, she had found purpose by bringing hope to others. In the eyes of every child, she saw the stories her mother used to tell her, and that she had forgotten. One day, Rachel took the stage in the largest square of the town to give a speech. During her speech, every sentence was filled with determination. By the end of the speech, everyone couldn't hold back their tears, because Rachel had found the love of God, which had once made her lose her faith, by touching her own life and the lives of others. Sometimes, Rachel said, we are forced to find a light in our darkest moments. The voice we hear from God doesn't always come from the sky. Maybe sometimes that voice comes from an apple, a smile, or a helping hand. Rachel's words deeply affected the people of the town. Light of Kindness had now grown into a social movement, spreading across every village and town. People worked day and night to help one another. The charity was named after a saying her mother once told her, "Kindness is the language of God." Years later, the town became a small childhood park. In that park, Every child grew up surrounded by God's love and the goodness of life. Rachel sat alone beneath a tree in the middle of the park. Around the tree, children were running, smiling, and playing. That day, Rachel realized once again, by offering hope and God's love to others, she had healed her own heart.